Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode 49, Lacan as a viewer of Akira. And we're going to be talking about Otomo's Akira, Lacan's Akira, and Lacan's four fundamental concepts. So the concept of this I got the idea a bit from another podcast I'm researching for. Zizek has got a book called Lacan Explained, and I really drew inspiration from Zizek's exploration of Lacan as a viewer of Alien, right? So I think in this podcast, at best, we will be achieving Lacan as a viewer of Akira, but I'll be content with just getting to viewing Akira as a Lacanian. So if maybe we can introduce some Otomo, we'll introduce some concepts of Akira, we'll talk about Lacan, and then we'll really deep dive into those two main texts. So as people may know, Katsushiro Otomo was the creator of Akira, an anime that was released in 1988. I was just recently in Tokyo on a trip, and I picked up this amazing deluxe edition DVD box set. So I'm going to kind of use this as the visual for the video. It's kind of an unboxing a bit, but it also has a very handsome set of booklets and storyboard art. So I think it's a nice visual as we kind of deep dive into Otomo's work. It not only did this movie revolutionize anime, but it also delved into the idea of power, identity, social dynamics, the human psyche. The film Akira takes place in a dystopian version of Neo-Tokyo. And you see the cities unraveling, just like our characters are sort of unraveling. And a little fun fact about this, too, is the setting of the Akira anime depicts, I believe it's supposed to take place in 2019. Comments, let me know if I think it's 2019, and it depicts Neo-Tokyo about to host or they're building an Olympic stadium, and it was odd that actually in 2020 was the Summer Olympics, right? And they had to delay that until 2021. So it's kind of interesting, a little bit of predicting the future. So this is way back in 1988. They're projecting forward to 2019, and here we are a couple years after that. So we're already in the future. And okay, and then obviously for Lacan, on the other side, so in a way we'll foil Lacan to Otomo, right? Because Lacan, a prominent French psychoanalyst, he did his rebuild of Freud, let's call it, in his many-year seminar, and talks a lot about the unconscious, language, desire, formations of subjectivity. And those two texts that we're going to really dig into are Akira, which is sort of a collection of his influential writings, and one of the few books that are actually written by Lacan, where most of his other books, like the Four Fundamental Concepts, come out of his seminar. In this case, it was his seminar 10, I believe, seminar 10. So we'll so then we'll kind of look at how Akira offers this sort of collection of essays on language, desire, the unconscious. And this is where we get an essay on Lacan's idea of the symbolic order, the mirror stage, interplay between the conscious and the unconscious. That will kind of come into play with this look at Akira. And then also we'll look at four fundamental concepts where four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis to be complete. And this really illuminates more of Lacanian theories like the idea of the unconscious, Lacan's notion of the real, which is a very technical term, desire, and even ideas of transference. So I think through this we can kind of look at some of these symbols that are there, where we'll look at Akira through the lens of Lacanian theory, and then we can unravel some understanding between this anime masterpiece and maybe some of these meanings that come through this. So let's start out with start out maybe with, we'll just talk a bit about, start with some of the concepts that are in Akira. So inside of Akira, we have one of his seminal works is the mirror stage as the formative function of the I and the agency of the letter of unconscious or reason since Freud. And so these essays really dig deep into the idea of the symbolic dimension that I want to kind of apply to Akira, right? So if we look at Akira, let's start off with the mirror stage, right? In Akira, you kind of see this concept of the mirror stage in the different character developments. For example, like Akira explores this fragmented nature of Tetsuo, right? So the main character Tetsuo is struggling throughout this movie with sort of a fractured self, right? So he has a distorted reflection in a way. So, and you see that there's a lot of these images in Akira of, so Tetsuo always activated from his childhood, where he had been part of some experiments, right? Or a lab that has experiments that have created Akira themselves, and also other children with sort of psychic abilities. And you see Tetsuo struggling as his unconscious power starts to rise up. He also starts to lose his control of this, right? So sort of a mirror is actually shattering in this. And it's sort of like a disruption of his mirror phase as his identity sort of disintegrates, right? So we can kind of go a little bit into that. I think that mirror stage is interesting. There's also the idea of, if we look at the agency of the letter, right? So agency of the letter talks a lot about the role of language in the shaping of the unconscious. And in Akira, we kind of see this in the form of how language and communication are playing a real role in the character's experiences, interactions. Like, for example, there's this kind of mental power that happens with Tetsuo where he's able to use telekinesis, he's able to manipulate things. And you also see the progeria children who also are from the laboratory, right? They're able to use telepathy, they can manipulate memories, they can cause hallucinations. You know, when the giant teddy bear kind of comes in the room, and then Tetsuo kind of realizes what's going on and he breaks this. So this is kind of communication through these networks of higher power, right? So you see that the symbols are mediating these character desires, and they're actually, you know, Otomo is basically visualizing kind of this unconscious, the unconscious fears, the unconscious desires get to be manifested visually in the anime, right? And they're also, you can see them as constructions of their subjectivity. And I think that another concept that comes out of Akira is the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis. And really in this essay, we really talk, you know, Lacan talks about this relation between speech, language, and the unconscious, right? And this is maybe his graph of desire comes out of this. And in Akira, the characters are exchanging these hidden desires and anxieties, you know, and you can see how this mirrors between the chaos of the city and the chaos of the characters, right? And there's also this government agency, and we'll talk about that in aggressivity a bit. So there's a lot of coded kind of language. It's kind of a lot of encoding of psychological concepts that Otomo brilliantly kind of makes an action adventure out of it. At the same time, it's kind of a deep character and an unsettling story of this ambiguity of a sort of a distorted communication, maybe between the conscious and the unconscious. And the film kind of reflects this Lacanian idea on the symbolic nature of language and the way the characters are wrestling constantly, especially Tetsuo. But you even see it with Kaneda, because Kaneda is sort of the mentor of Tetsuo. And then he ends up having to be the destroyer of Tetsuo in a way. And then he ends up, in a strange way, still being compassionate for Tetsuo the whole time. It's a very interesting dynamic. He's sort of like sees Tetsuo as being the bratty kid, and Tetsuo, without his agency, sort of ends up losing his form, and you can really see how that evolves, right? So I think, some of these objects from Akira are very interesting. They kind of correspond to the idea of Akira. We deep dive in them a little more, but I'm going to kind of go on into. I think if we look at the four fundamental concepts, also I think that this is interesting space as well. Let's say the groundwork established sort of by this kind of intersects with four fundamental concepts in Akira. The main concepts are namely the unconscious, the real, desire, and transference. So let's kind of use these as like that lens of viewing the film. So with the unconscious, let's start with the unconscious, right? So with Lacanian theory, the unconscious is a realm of repressed desire, there's fantasy, there's drives, a number of things that shapes our thoughts and behavior, right? But usually this is in that space of, in psychoanalysis, you would be uncovering what's in the unconscious. But in Akira, we actually have Otomo allowing us to witness the unconscious manifesting in an anime way, right? So this is what makes the anime so visually appealing. It's sort of like, if you think of it in a Freudian sense, right? Freud would write his interpretation of dreams, right? And in dreams, we see the movie in our dream. And then when we look upon that in psychoanalysis, Freud would sort of have all of his, if you dream of this, I had a dream of something, and then that dream kind of can be interpreted as an expression of this. But if we take it from a Lacanian view of Akira, where the anime is visualizing for us, so some of those features that we get of this unconscious manifestation is, I say namely, is in the psychic powers unleashed by Tetsuo, and even the allure or the mystery of Akira's past. It's never really revealed to us. So it's sort of like we get this mythical figure of Akira, dismembered. We find that he's dismembered, and yet he's a vision for us still, right? So when these psychic powers are revealed, they sort of reflect this eruption of repressed desires and hidden potentials within the characters. And it's also a distortion in dream, in hallucinations. So say when the children, we talked about at the teddy bear scene, they manifest things to try to scare Tetsuo, but actually he sees through those illusions, right? So, and then eventually, this sort of unraveling of the fear and trauma and suppressed memories, it kind of goes into a kind of physical manifestation, sort of a psychosis, when Tetsuo is no longer able to control his body. You see how there was, he has first these bouts of anger, and we'll talk about this aggressivity in a bit. But when he loses his actual form, at first his arm, there's a great scene where he's sitting on the throne, and his arm, like all these wires and things and veins start going into the stone chair. And then he pulls his cloak over it to hide it. And then soon after that, he begins to transform into that baby. That's the unraveling of this fear, this trauma. It's the release of his inability to ego inflation, right? So let's sort of a little bit about the unconscious. Let's go a little bit about the Lacanian real. So in the real, this is something that's part of a system for Lacan of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. And in a strange way, all of our conscious thought is almost the imaginary, because it is image, right? We have a view of the world that's not all the real technical things. You think of it like this: the description of color from the real is sort of like these angstroms of light, which we really don't know how to experience. But in the imaginary, we see red, we see green. We don't see bandwidths of light. We don't see it as a physical phenomenon. So the symbolic sort of is that place between the real. And in this realm, we sort of can, beyond language and representation, we can also sort of look for things like that are ungraspable or traumatic things or elusive aspects of our existence that the imaginary and the symbolic have sort of maybe are resistant to language or resistant to representation or even resistant to symbolization, right? So in Akira, you have this cataclysmic event, right? It was triggered originally by Akira's power. And there was a subsequent destruction of Neo-Tokyo. And then, Akira's been dismembered and studied, and his parts are kept in this dome, at absolute zero that Tetsuo eventually finds, right? So all of this destruction of Neo-Tokyo is kind of an intrusion of the real, right? It's like things have gotten out of beyond the symbolic order, out of the imaginary, and it's sort of manifested in the real, right? So the chaos, the violence that we see in Neo-Tokyo, right? The disruption of the symbolic order, and this revealing of these uncontrollable forces that lie beneath the surface of human civilization. And it's sort of like without that veneer of control, like if you think of Tetsuo, right? Tetsuo, without his maturity, right, at least he had Kaneda as sort of a big brother figure. But as he wrestles with his unconscious, he's unable to sort of grasp it in a way where he can be omnipotent and also be in control of it, right? So he has sort of given the too much power, too much access to the real without enough mechanisms of the symbolic, right? He didn't have enough symbolic language to understand, to turn it into the imaginary, to reflect on the real through the symbolic into the imaginary, right? So I think this is very powerful. Maybe next concept that we can go into is desire, always a central theme in Lacan. So desire kind of relates to drive. It relates to a fundamental lack, or at times an incompleteness within the subject. The way drive and desire interact. So sort of this desire is a sort of, for Lacan, is a ever-present force where our drive and our actions are questing to fulfill it, right? So we're always looking to close the loop back to the ego, right? And I think that drive and desire are well discussed. I mean, actually, Lacan has a whole lecture on the desire. We can bring up a little bit of that as well. I believe it's complementary here. But if you see in Akira, this desire really permeates the narrative. You sort of see the bike gang at the beginning. These are kids who are just looking for a place in this crazy world of Neo-Tokyo. But then you see as Tetsuo's power starts to rise, Tetsuo's desire for more power increases, and his power increases, right? And he also has a desire for recognition. And this is a control, this idea of control is sort of a driving force throughout the film, right? Kaneda also is looking for a purpose, right? And in a softer way, as a kind of the main character, sub-character, the hero arc. I guess there's 2 hero arcs. What do you guys think? Kaneda's desire for purpose and connection sort of, it starts him out on this journey where he's going to go save his friend, rescue his friend. But then once the truth is discovered, you sort of see that now he has to take responsibility for his friend. Like someone has to stop this, right? As Tetsuo starts to get out of control. So you see that the character's desire, you also, Kaneda has the desire to protect, right? Protect the girl in the story. And also his friend, and also Tetsuo. But he ends up becoming the protector of Neo-Tokyo as well. So the characters, the various characters' desires, let's say, are they're sort of intertwined with identity and agency, and the sense of a pursuit of wholeness in this really fractured world of the Neo-Tokyo that Otomo gives us, right? The world's crazy. You can always see what's going on in the background. And even when Tetsuo's raging out his destructions, you can see in the background there's all kinds of, it's destruction within a sea of destruction, right? Finally, we'll talk a little bit about Lacanian transference. So obviously transference of psychoanalysis is the idea of when the unconscious desire or emotion or conflict is transferred onto another person or an object. It's also used in psychoanalysis a lot where the analyst will sometimes invoke a kind of transference to help the patient analysand sort of reveal some of let the unconscious come up in analysis, right? In a analytic way. So obviously transference has a concept within it in even just in human relationships too. There's sort of projection that happens. There's a healthy level of that, and there's a healthy aspect of that transference. When you look up to someone, so think of how the way Tetsuo had looked up to Kaneda, but then just like one may replace an analyst with a father figure, something like this, or an authority figure. But then there's always Freud always pointed out the idea of at the end of therapy, there's a sort of disgust for the therapist because now this person has seen all of your dirty laundry and you see that and then sort of you kind of once you've realized that the analyst had to sort of cajole you to become aware, to become conscious, right? Sometimes there's an odd sense in this in therapy. This is already the end of therapy, right? But we do see this come up with Tetsuo because Tetsuo at first he sort of had this hero worship for Kaneda. And then that sort of turns into a rivalry with Kaneda. And then it becomes an all-out war with Kaneda because now he has the power. It reminds me a lot of the dynamic of these two, especially the end battle. It reminds me of that Star Trek pilot with Kirk and Gary Mitchell, right? And how Gary Mitchell becomes super powerful. And then they were on a friendly basis. And then it becomes an adversarial basis. And then the power corrupts Mitchell as it does Tetsuo. And then it becomes the dynamic of that transference is apparent. So in Akira, this transference element is really this complex bond between Tetsuo and Kaneda. And the relationship oscillates, right? You have friendship, you have rivalry, you have projection of the unfulfilled desires onto each other. Like Kaneda bullies him sometimes, and then he wants to save him, and then in the end he has to destroy him. And Tetsuo calls out for his friend, right? When he's struggling, even though he had the rivalry, at the end when he's starting to literally inflate into that giant body horror baby, and we'll talk about the body horror aspect in a bit, but he still calls out to Kaneda, like, help me. He says, help me, right? So this transference of power, fear, emotional entanglements really helps drive the narrative forward, and also kind of has kind of takes us through those four fundamental concepts of Lacan. I think the other, we talked about aggressivity. Maybe we can talk a little bit about aggressivity because I think that this is quite interesting. I think we can think of aggressivity from a Lacanian point of view from a number of areas in relation to Akira. So if we think of aggression as a manifestation of the unconscious or as an unconscious desire, so we also often see this, so there's a lot of aggression in Akira. I mean, the classic opening scene is a biker gang war that's bleeding out into Neo-Tokyo, but it's also reflecting the aggression that's going on. There's all kinds of, and especially in the Otomo's manga, there's all these other themes that the film doesn't even go into with religion and cults and all these other things, the chaos, the riots that are going on in Neo-Tokyo. But in the film, you really see that there's a lot of unfulfilled desire here. So Tetsuo, Kaneda, they're starting out this biker gang, but then once they start to activate this power, you can see that these different factions within the film are kind of engaged in these violent acts, power control, but it's also sort of around self-realization. Even I think of that scene where the scientist is looking at the pattern of Akira. He's got this, he's seeing that Tetsuo is actually getting to the Akira level, and even though that the last time Akira, his power rose up, and think of this ultimate violence as, Akira's power caused this sort of destruction of Tokyo. And so now that we're in Neo Tokyo and it's happening again, the scientists still can't help but be unable to be aware or to integrate that conscious realization that sort of animated circle of dancing lights represents of the Akira wavelength that Tetsu is approaching, right? So aggression can kind of be seen as a desire to assert one's subjectivity or one's ego in a maybe what's the desire is to overcome the feeling of lack, right? You see Tetsuo has these violent outbursts, and then once his power levels up to this violence, he wants to just keep surpassing his limitations, right? And you can understand it within this sort of framework of manifestations of the unconscious desire. But there's also a death drive aspect. Freud, Lacan's concept of the death drive is kind of founded from Freud's concept of thanatos in the Freudian sense, which is like this sort of self-destructive and also somewhat aggressive tendencies that human beings have. So in Akira, the characters, there's really is a death drive. You even see before they have psychic powers, there's this motorcycle gang where they're risking their lives, fighting these gangs, driving at high-speed chase, taking on the military. There's all kinds of this stuff going on in Neo Tokyo. But then as the characters' powers rise, you see these aggressive actions turning toward a destructive use of these psychic powers, right? You see the progeria children in the lab. They're trying to be very cool, but they're fearful, right? They're fearful that Tetsuo is going to go bonkers, I think. And then there's all this militaristic response and control. So this is all like an anti-militaristic side to it all. And this is all manifestations of the death drive. So you can kind of see that the film explores the violence, destruction, the pursuit of annihilation, sort of linked to this human behavior as a primal death drive and destructive force that has to be, basically has to be understood. And you can kind of see the children play a role in understanding it. You see Kaneda's journey, because he has a kind of a love aspect. He's a protector aspect. Some of these ways are there to overcome. And you can even see the Zen-like way Akira appears for a moment, right? Like Akira comes back. And maybe there's some message at the end that we see Tetsuo is sort of alive somewhere, so that the story has a sort of a metaphysical side to it, right? But then there's a response of Lacanian theory about the relation in the response of aggression, like aggression as a response to the symbolic order, right? So Lacan's maybe he's emphasizing the conflict between individual desires and the demands of the symbolic order. So you think of the social cultural framework around society, and you can see that in Akira, the aggression arises as a response from the oppressive nature, whether it's the symbolic order represented by the government or the military or the lab or even, the gang politics, the big brother politics. There's a number of responses to the social cultural framework, and that's a response to a symbolic order. So you see that many of the characters are acting in acts of rebellion and violence, and this is where they're trying to disrupt the established order, let's say. So it's definitely very much this destructive impulse throughout the film has sort of got a militaristic and anti-government kind of feel to it. But it's also, that's the government of the unconscious, and by making it conscious, you could heal that over, right? So it's very, Lacan writes in Aggressivity in Psychoanalysis, it talks about how it's within the framework of desire, the unconscious, and subjectivity, right? And this aggression is sort of intertwined with a cathartic release of energy, right? So this dynamics of the death drive, the antagonistic aspects of human existence. But you can see how this sort of cathartic release is what actually the film is like a cathartic release for us, because here we are seeing this dystopia and these characters trying to find a place in a world without form, and even a character literally losing form, right? Tetsuo's aggressive outbursts, he unleashes his psychic powers. This is sort of a cathartic release of this pent-up emotions and desire. He was bullied, and all the pent-up desires of just surviving in Neo-Tokyo and even trying to find a place in that world. So he's asserting this to exert control, but obviously it doesn't work in the end, and he sort of loses control. And then you can see aggression as a death drive, where they're Tetsuo's pursuit of power, destroying everything in his path, is sort of like this. He just becomes this sort of really a monster. And we'll kind of go into the body horror aspect of it too, because I think that that's really what happens as a response to the symbolic order. He ends up breaking the symbolic order of himself, right? So with the body horror, right, you think of body horror in the sense of, Tetsuo's body is exploding, he's losing control. And I think this kind of goes back to the concepts of the real, actually. So with the real, so let's say the real is, in Lacanian terms, beyond linguistic and symbolic, right? So it's the unrepresentable, maybe the traumatic, or something that defies comprehension in a way, right? So it's that kind of materialist way of seeing the world. And I think Akira himself is sort of the symbol of the real. So if we start with Akira, then we can go into the body horror. So Akira has this immense psychic power, and he surpassed human understanding and control. He was the cause of the destructive psychic phenomenon that destroyed Neo-Tokyo, and then they had to basically take Akira apart. They cataloged him in those containers, right? So all the characters' encounters with Akira involve this different range of emotion: the awe, fear, fascination, this existential unease, and also like this anticipation of his coming. And they're sort of confronting this reality, right? So Tetsuo becomes like a conduit for the real. Like he's trying to access the real through the symbolic order, right? So, and as his psychic powers emerge, he's actually gaining access to Akira's power. And as he goes through this transformation, his identity starts to fracture, right? His unresolved complexes, let's call it, he becomes, start to shatter as he becomes this vessel of power. And I think we can kind of talk about this Tetsuo's journey with the real, where the boundaries of the self dissolve and the individual has to confront the limits of the symbolic order, right? So in the real, Akira is not a metaphor, but he's a tangible force. He's the fabric of reality. And the sort of this critique of the human attempt to control the uncontrollable, right? So Akira, the film, reflects on this fragility sort of the human structure, like the limits of our knowledge, the boundaries of self. And I think that when those boundaries start to break down and transcend, this is where we get to that kind of body horror space. I mean, we kind of see this a little bit, maybe this is a bit more like Ethics of Psychoanalysis from Lacan's Seminar 8, but the idea of the body and jouissance in like the psychoanalytic framework. So the idea is this grotesque and unsettling transformations that are in Akira are kind of like, I mean, this is kind of goes back to Lacan as a viewer of Alien, this lamella type of thing, right? The idea of examining the character's struggle with their body, the loss of body integrity, the excessive enjoyment of the use of the power is tied to a physical transformation, right? I think in Four Fundamental Concepts, we also have this concept of the subject and of the unconscious and of desire and drive, right? So the disintegration of the body, the loss of the body boundaries, this sort of enjoyment of using the power, but then also the bodily transformation as the symbolic self is no longer able to talk to the real, right? So this fragmented self represents itself in this body horror, you know. You know, we see this loss of bodily integrity. I think this is one of the most disturbing parts of the film, really. On top of all the other things, this is a horrific transformation because it also shows Tetsuo returns to almost the childlike child. He says, "Help me," to Kaneda, right? And the way he screams Kaneda is very horrifying for us too. It sort of has a cosmic horror to it. So this is like excessive jouissance, right? There's something about unchecked jouissance. There's no castration happening until the children group together and the white light kind of cuts it off, right? And we can sort of talk about this in terms of Lacanian short circuit in the graph of desire. So Lacan's discussion of jouissance in the body helps us to sort of see how this desire for power and control led to this excessive destruction relation to his body, in Tetsuo's case, right? So the film is like an attempt to attain jouissance by manipulating power and transcending body limits, but then it kind of backfires, right? So this kind of backfiring is sort of the way the unconscious is manifesting in the body horror, right? So all the repressed fears and traumas and desires are actually visualized in the film Akira. So I think body horror is a very interesting part of it, but I think we can also see it, maybe in terms of cosmic horror as well. So there's this kind of cosmic dread to it. You know, Akira himself is kind of kept in that cosmic horror kind of way where we don't really see him, but he's playing a role in the background, right? And as these strange events happen, this existential dread of Akira is off in the distance. And then the very true dread that the power is Tetsuo's power is going to go to a level where it could destroy even Neo-Tokyo, right? And if we see some of this ideas of the short circuit, so maybe just to go quickly, it's not in the, it's kind of in the seminar 7 or Ethics of Psychoanalysis, seminar 11, but he talks about the idea of short-circuiting the graph of desire. So Lacan has this idea of a graph of desire, and it's like there's an object, he talks about Edgar Allan Poe's Purloined Letter. So the idea is the elusive object of desire that can never be satisfied. Like Tetsuo is looking for something, and then that he gets this power, but he still doesn't know what he's looking for. And this sort of like the drive, the perpetual urge to satisfy a drive that's never fully satisfied, right? So there's an inherent lack, and he can never fulfill that lack. There's sort of in Lacanian terms, like a foreclosure, right? The name of the father kind of thing. So Tetsuo's desire is insatiable, it's constantly shifting, and as he gains more power, his desire intensifies. And then it leads to this escalating transformations that eventually destabilize his identity and his body integrity, right? And you see that sort of in the ethics of psychoanalysis, Lacan talks about this idea of the short circuit, right? So Lacan delves into this ethical implementations of desire in the relationship to well-being, right? And talks about like Freudian pleasure principle and this reality principle and this distinction between the two, and this highlighting the conflicts and tensions that come up between like when the instinct encounters social and ethical constraints, right? So you see Tetsuo is very much driven by instinct. He's driven by his drive. He's driven by his desires, right? And Tetsuo's transformation is kind of a short-circuiting of this graph. You know, we would kind of call short circuits like where the neuroses are, right? All the classic Freudian neuroses, Lacan has graphed as when a graph is working normally, desires come up and then they end. You know, there's a sort of a jouissance and there's a castration in the sense that the desire is not endless. And you can see that when Tetsuo first starts to use his power, it's one thing, but when he starts to go beyond the use of his power, it's something quite different. So you see that Tetsuo's desire is insatiable, and it's constantly shifting. And as he gains more power, his desire intensifies, and this leads to these escalating body degradations. And Tetsuo is also really willing to bypass ethical consideration, which leads to not only destruction of his surroundings, but he starts to jeopardize his own well-being, and then that's ultimately manifested brilliantly as the body horror, right? So I think that body horror is a huge unchecked, the framework to understand Tetsuo's transformation is unchecked power and the consequences of the unchecked desire. This is a theme throughout the film. So hopefully that was interesting. I think we'll leave it at that for now. I just sort of putting that out there as Lacan as a viewer of Akira, looking at some of those themes from Akira and from Four Fundamental Concepts. Hopefully you guys thought this was interesting. As you guys know, we do this podcast. I've been trying to do it about every 2 weeks. I do have another channel on YouTube, and I'm working on some new concepts. So listen, as usual, guys, your comments are real valued. Like and subscribe below. Thank you guys for the Patreon members that are out there. I know a lot of you have asked for some of the books to be made digital, some of our Pontos Fathom Press books, and we're actually putting together that podcast series. So really great thanks to all the subscribers out there, and thank you for your comments. I do read all the comments. I like to have that dialogue going, and I think if we can get to 1,000 subscribers, I'll get this. I'm trying to get a little bit more regular in the concepts. It's just between work and other responsibilities, it's tough to. I want to put something out new that's not out there already, so hopefully you guys like it, and really appreciate your watching. So like and subscribe. If you want to be notified, you can ring that notification bell, and really appreciate it. We really want to hit that goal of 1,000 subscribers to get us going and get this content out to more viewers. One other quick thing. Patreon, I'm going to do a shout out to all of our Patreon subscribers. Thanks a lot. You can go out to our Patreon. We have a number of books, physical books out in our bookstore down below in the link. If you want to go check out our books, we've got the Disclosure from the Necronomicon Fragment. We've talked about some of these concepts here. Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, Alchemy of Azathoth, Hermeticism of Hastur. You can check those books out if you'd like to help support the channel, if you'd like to check out some cool books. We've also got the trilogy of Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines, starting out with Impedance and Admittance in Desiring Machines. It's got a Lacanian sense to it, so that could be interesting. Also do the Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, looking to science fiction, film, Deleuzian film theory, Bergsonian theory, and Stiglitz, looking at this, but also from a Lacanian point of view. Our third volume, these 2 volumes are out in the store. Our third volume is coming probably end of this year, Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency. And then finally, we've been starting to serialize as books, the podcast series. So we've got the first 3 volumes in the works. Volume 1 is available. It's Jungian Alchemy and Horror and Sci-Fi. We've got some esoteric anthroposophy and theosophical versions of them. I do have a draft working on volumes 4 and 5 and 6, which will most likely be the topics around the esoteric dragon, the Neptune lectures that we did, and then finally some of this Lacanian sci-fi anime that we're doing this round. So hopefully those are interesting to you guys. If you are interested, go check them out. It helps to support the channel, and it's also great to have you guys on here. Looking to make this into a live stream at some point, and that would be awesome to get your feedback either here or in a long form on our Patreon. So thanks a lot for watching, and we will see you on the next podcast, and talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.